What happens when the man trained to be the most disciplined soldier king in Europe turns out to be, at heart, a musician? In the 18th century, a Prussian crown prince, who spent his youth composing flute sonatas and reading Voltaire, grew up to conquer Silesia, fight one of the most devastating wars in European history, minor German kingdom into a great power. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara.
The tension in Frederick's life is not simply between art and war. It is between who he was and who the Prussian state required him to become, and the question of whether those two things were ever truly reconciled. Tonight, we turn to a king whose flute playing and whose battlefield command were both expressions of the same extraordinary intelligence and the same lifelong need for control. The question is not whether Frederick the Great was a musician or a warrior, but what it means that he was genuinely and seriously both, and what that duality reveals about the nature of power in the age of enlightened absolutism.
Frederick composed over 100 flute sonatas and 4 flute concertos, performed regularly at his court, and maintained a serious musical practice until the final years of his life. This was not a hobby or a diplomatic affectation, it was a deep and sustained engagement with music as a form of thought.
We are speaking about Frederick II of Prussia, known as Frederick the Great. Composer.
He was shaped by a youth of systematic suppression, and he became a ruler whose court became one of the great centers of musical and intellectual life in Europe. Understanding how those two things connect is the key to understanding Frederick.
Then let us begin with the father and the youth that made Frederick both who he was and who he had to pretend to be.
Frederick was born in 1712 in Berlin, the son of Frederick William I of Prussia, a ruler whose personality and governing philosophy could hardly have been more different from his son's. Frederick William was an obsessive military administrator who built the Prussian army into one of the most formidable in Europe, lived with extreme personal frugality, and regarded the arts with open contempt. The young Frederick showed early and unmistakable inclinations toward music, literature, and French culture. He read widely, corresponded with Voltaire from his teens, and practiced the flute with discipline. His father responded to these interests with a combination of mockery, prohibition, and physical punishment. The household of Frederick William was not simply strict. It was, for the Crown Prince, a regime of sustained psychological violence.
So, the most militaristic court in Europe produced a crown prince, whose deepest instincts ran in entirely the opposite direction.
Yes, and here is the first thing we need to correct about the standard account. Frederick is often presented as someone who transcended this opposition between art and war, as though his musical life and his military life were two separate compartments of an unusually capacious personality. The historical evidence suggests something more integrated and more troubling. The same qualities that made him a formidable military commander, the precision, the relentlessness, the need for complete mastery of his instrument, were present in his music from the beginning. The crisis of his youth came in 1730, when Frederick, then 18, attempted to flee Prussia with his close friend Hans Hermann von Katte. His father intercepted them, had Frederick arrested, tried von Katte before a military court, and forced Frederick to watch the execution of his friend from a prison window. Von Katte was 26 years old. The trauma of this event marked Frederick for the rest of his life.
So his father used the execution of his closest companion as an instrument of political and personal submission.
Yes, Frederick was subsequently imprisoned at Kustrin and forced into administrative duties under close supervision. Over the following years he performed the public role expected of him, eventually agreeing to an arranged marriage and demonstrating sufficient military competence to regain his father's conditional trust. He never shared a household with his wife after the early years of their marriage. The relationship was a dynastic arrangement that served its formal purpose and nothing more.
So by the time he came to power, he had already learned to present one face publicly while maintaining another privately.
Precisely, and this capacity for strategic self-presentation served him throughout his reign. His father passed away in 1740, and Frederick became king at the age of 28. Within months he had invaded Silesia, a wealthy Austrian province, without declaration of war and without any clear legal pretext. The Europe that had expected a philosopher king received a conqueror instead.
So the artistic temperament his father had despised became in power, the mask behind which a highly effective military strategist operated.
Yes, though the mask is perhaps too simple a metaphor. His court at Sanssouci, the palace he built at Potsdam, was a serious intellectual and musical environment, not a decorative one. Voltaire lived there for several years. The musicians he employed were among the finest in Europe. The meeting with Johann Sebastian Bach in 1747 is one of the most documented and most analyzed encounters in musical history. Frederick summoned Bach to Potsdam, reportedly greeting him before he had time to change his traveling clothes, and presented him with a complex chromatic theme, challenging him to improvise a fugue upon it. Bach obliged. He later developed this theme into the musical offering, a collection of canons and fugues dedicated to Frederick.
So Frederick provided the seed material for one of the great works of the Baroque period.
Yes, and the nature of the theme he chose is itself revealing. It is long, chromatic, and deliberately difficult to develop in strict counterpoint. Whether Frederick composed it himself or selected it from his own musical notebooks is debated. What is not debated is that he understood its complexity, and that his invitation to Bach was an act of genuine musical engagement, not merely ceremonial patronage. Frederick's own compositions occupy an interesting position in the history of Baroque music. He wrote in a style consistent with the gallant idiom of the mid-18th century, influenced by his teacher, Johann Joachim Quantz, who was also his court composer, and the leading flute pedagogue of the era. His sonatas show formal competence, melodic invention, and a real feel for the expressive possibilities of the Baroque flute. They are not the works of a dilettante. They are the works of a serious amateur in the original sense of the word, one who loves deeply and works with discipline.
So his music is neither negligible nor transformative. It is the music of a man who understood the form from the inside.
Exactly, and this inside knowledge is what distinguished his patronage from the decorative court patronage of lesser rulers. He knew when his musicians were playing well, and when they were not. He chose repertoire with informed judgment. The musical culture of Sanssouci was shaped by someone who participated in it as a practitioner, not merely as a sponsor. The military dimension of his reign ran in parallel with the musical one throughout. The First Silesian War from 1740 to 1742 secured Silesia for Prussia. The Second Silesian War from 1744 to 1745 confirmed the conquest against Austrian attempts to reverse it. The 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763 was the most severe test of his reign, in which Prussia faced a coalition of Austria, France, Russia, Sweden, and Saxony simultaneously.
So, at the height of his musical life, he was also fighting for the survival of Prussia against the combined weight of most of Europe.
Yes, and here is the turning point in how we should understand Frederick. During the 7 Years' War, Prussia came close to military and financial collapse on multiple occasions. Frederick responded with tactical innovations, extraordinary logistical discipline, and a personal resilience that his contemporaries found astonishing. He composed music during the war. He read classical philosophy during campaigns. These were not escapes from the pressure. They were methods of maintaining the internal equilibrium that his command required.
So, the music was not separate from the war. It was part of how he sustained himself through it.
Precisely. Prussia survived the 7 Years' War essentially intact, though at enormous human and economic cost. The war established Prussia as a major European power and Frederick as one of the great military commanders of the century. His reputation was made. The second half of his reign was devoted to reconstruction, administrative reform, and the continuation of the court culture he had built before the war. In his later years, Frederick's flute playing declined as his teeth deteriorated. He continued to compose and to engage with music as a listener and commissioner, but the physical practice that had been central to his daily life was lost to him. Contemporary accounts suggest he found this loss deeply painful.
So?
Yes. He passed away in 1786 at the age of 74, having reigned for 46 years. He left no direct heir. He had requested a simple burial at Sanssouci beside his dogs, a request that was ignored for 2 centuries before being honored in 1991, following German reunification. The question of Frederick's personal life has been a subject of historical discussion for generations. His close friendship with Hans Hermann von Katte, his lifelong separation from his wife, his preference for male intellectual companionship, and the nature of certain other relationships at court have led many historians to conclude that his private emotional life was oriented in ways that the dynastic and social norms of his era required him to conceal. Frederick himself was characteristically oblique on the subject, and the evidence is suggestive rather than definitive.
So, the suppression his father imposed on his artistic life may have extended to the suppression of his personal identity as well.
Yes, and this dimension of his biography is relevant to understanding the emotional texture of his musical life. The flute was the one domain in which Frederick could express something private and unguarded, in a form that his position permitted, and even required him to share publicly. The intimacy of his compositions, their tendency toward lyrical introspection within formal constraints, may reflect more than aesthetic preference. His relationship with Voltaire deserves specific attention. The two men corresponded from 1736, when Frederick was still crown prince, and their exchange of letters over several decades represents one of the most sustained intellectual friendships between a ruler and a philosopher in European history. Voltaire lived at Sanssouci from 1750 to 1753, an arrangement that ultimately ended in mutual frustration. Frederick was too controlling as a host and too dismissive of Voltaire's literary vanities. Voltaire was too independent in his opinions and too free with his pen.
So even his most celebrated intellectual friendship could not survive the reality of proximity to absolute power.
Yes, and this is characteristic of Frederick's relationships generally. He was drawn to brilliant people and needed intellectual companionship. But he was also constitutionally unable to tolerate equals, a trait that his father's regime had instilled in him and that his own absolute authority reinforced. The court he created at Sanssouci was intellectually serious, but it was organized around his tastes, his schedule, and his authority. It was not a community of equals. It was a cultivated court. The figure of Johann Joachim Quantz, Frederick's flute teacher and court composer, illuminates something important about how Frederick organized his musical life. Quantz was contracted exclusively to Frederick from 1741 until his death in 1773. His sole responsibility was to compose for the king, teach the king, and perform with the king. He produced over 300 flute concertos, specifically for Frederick's use. This arrangement was generous to Quantz financially, and was also an expression of Frederick's need for complete possession of those who served his most private interests.
So even in music, Frederick's relationship to those around him was structured by ownership and exclusivity.
Yes, and this is the through line of his character from youth to old age. The boy who had been denied control over his own life became the king who exercised absolute control over everyone in his. The music, the philosophy, the military campaigns, the administrative reforms, these were all expressions of the same underlying will, shaped by a youth in which that will had been systematically broken, and then, at the 30th moment of accession, suddenly released without any external constraint.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to understand Frederick as both a cultural figure and a political one, where would you invite them to continue?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with Frederick the Great, King of Prussia, by Tim Lanning.
So this is a biography that takes seriously both the military record and the musical and intellectual life, rather than treating one as more important than the other.
Lanning presents a detailed account of Frederick's life as both a ruler and cultural figure, examining his military achievements alongside his musical interests and intellectual engagements. The book situates his reign within the political and artistic transformations of 18th century Europe, offering real insight into how personal inclination and state responsibility coexisted in one of the most demanding careers of the era.
Is it accessible to readers without a background in Prussian or German history?
Lanning is one of the most readable historians of 18th century Europe. He builds the necessary context as he goes. A reader coming to Frederick for the first time will find the biography engaging and sufficiently self-contained to be followed without prior knowledge of the period.
So it gives the reader not only the life but the world that shaped it and that Frederick in turn shaped.
Precisely, and Lanning does not shy away from the contradictions. The book is honest about Frederick's personal severity, his treatment of subordinates, and the...
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
The immediate legacy of Frederick's reign was the transformation of Prussia from a secondary German state into one of the 5 great powers of Europe. This transformation was institutional as well as territorial. Frederick reformed the legal system, established religious toleration, expanded agricultural productivity, and built an administrative apparatus of notable efficiency. His influence on the subsequent development of the Prussian and later German state was enormous and persisted long after his death. The musical legacy is smaller in scale but not negligible. His flute compositions entered the repertoire and have been performed and recorded steadily since the 20th century revival of interest in Baroque music. The musical offering, the work his meeting with Bach produced, is recognized as one of the great contrapuntal works of the Western tradition. Frederick did not compose it, but the theme at its center came from him, and the encounter that produced it would not have occurred without his genuine musical engagement.
Though his contribution to the musical offering is indirect but real.
Yes, and this indirect contribution is a fitting symbol for his broader cultural legacy. Frederick was not the greatest composer of his era, he was not even close. But he created the conditions in which great music was made, heard, and valued at the highest levels of political power, and that is a different and in some ways rarer contribution. The complications of his legacy are considerable. His military campaigns caused enormous suffering. The 7 Years' War killed hundreds of thousands of people and devastated large areas of Central Europe. His administrative achievements rested on a system of serfdom in the eastern provinces that he reformed only marginally. His personal religious toleration coexisted with a political system that offered ordinary Prussians no meaningful participation in governance.
So the enlightened absolutism he embodied was genuinely enlightened in some respects and entirely absolute in others.
Precisely, and Frederick was entirely aware of this tension. He described himself as the first servant of the state, a formulation that acknowledged obligation without conceding accountability. He read the philosophers and corresponded with them, but he did not allow their ideas to constrain his exercise of power. His enduring relevance lies in the question his life poses about the relationship between personal depth and political power. Frederick was genuinely cultivated, genuinely curious, and genuinely capable of sustained aesthetic creation. He was also capable of invading a neighboring country without pretext, forcing a young man to watch his best friend be executed, and maintaining a system of forced labor across his territories. These were not compartmentalized, they were aspects of the same person exercising the same will in different domains.
So the lesson is not that culture softens power, but that culture and power can coexist in the same person without moderating each other.
Exactly, and this is perhaps the most important thing Frederick teaches us. The assumption that artistic sensibility produces political restraint, that the person who loves music or poetry will exercise power more gently, is not supported by his example. Frederick loved music deeply and exercised power without mercy when his interests required it. The flute and the cannon were both instruments of his will. The modern relevance of his story is perhaps sharpest in the context of cultural patronage and state power today. Governments and institutions continue to sponsor arts and music as expressions of national identity and soft power. The Frederican model, in which the ruler's personal engagement with culture becomes a statement of political authority, is not obsolete, it simply operates through different mechanisms.
So Frederick's court at Sanssouci is a distant ancestor of every state-sponsored arts institution that functions simultaneously as a cultural and political expression.
Yes, and understanding that ancestry matters, because it reminds us that cultural patronage is never purely cultural, it is always also a statement about who holds authority, and how they wish to be understood. Frederick understood this with perfect clarity, which is why he played the flute so seriously, and why he played it in public.
Thank you for staying with us tonight. And thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through this oppressed youth, the musical ambition, the military campaigns, and the complex legacy of the king who played the flute.
Frederick reminds us that the distance between the person who makes beauty and the person who causes suffering can be no distance at all.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.